My name is Scott Lindsay, and I'm the Chief of Police for the Red Oak ISD Police Department. Most of you watching are students in Red Oak ISD, and you are trying to figure out, why do we really have a Project Success drug education program? You know that you have a lot of fun with the officers, you know that you learn some lessons, but one of the things that I miss most of not being in the classroom is not being able to tell you the true story of why we have this program. Your safety and your right to learn in a safe and drug-free school district is the reason that our police officers work here. We believe that each of you are young people with great minds that can reach your dreams, but we also believe that bad choices such as drug use will end your dreams and maybe even your life. For you to understand why there is a Project Success class, you have to know one name: George William Raffield, Jr. George was a friend of mine, and it is because of him we started Project Success classes way back before most of you watching were even born in 1990. I would ask that you please pay attention to this video and listen to this very true story. Many of you have older brothers and sisters who have attended Red Oak and may have heard me tell this story or another one of my officers tell it. While what I am about to tell you happened over 20 years ago, it is still sticking in my mind just like yesterday. Growing up in Ferris, nearby, just a few miles away from here, I was a regular kid. I liked playing with my friends, I loved baseball, and even as I got older thought, I really want to be a baseball coach and a teacher. I began working for the Red Oak Police Department when I was only 18 years old. As a dispatcher then, with very little going on in Red Oak, and Ovilla Road only a 2-lane road with no fast food, no McDonald's, no Whataburgers. Nothing there but about 1,000 people in the city. And during that time, I was given a chance to go to the police academy by my chief then. And after I graduated the police academy, I went on to work as a patrolman for the city of Red Oak. That's where my story begins, way back in 1987. When I first graduated the academy, I was put on the deep night shift from 11 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning. That's where I met a guy named George Raffield. George and I hit it off right away. We were very close to the same age. He was 21 and I was 22. George became my dispatcher on the night shift, and we spent some time talking, a lot of time talking to each other about our childhood and our future. George was a great guy who grew up in Mesquite and had always wanted to be a police officer. He had been in the Police Explorer program in Mesquite, and after graduation he had went to the police academy. He would talk night after night with me about how he had seen drugs ruin lives and how he wanted to help change that. He and his girlfriend, who he was planning to marry, would come to my baseball games that I was coaching back then, and we would hang out at other times off duty. George came from a big family with lots of brothers and sisters, and he would talk about how he wanted to get married and have lots of kids, and he wanted to live in Red Oak. One morning, as we were about to get off work, just simply out of the blue, he said, "I will not be back. I'm going to work for my dad." And I was shocked, to say the least, at a guy who loved police work like no one I had ever known would all of a sudden say with no warning, "I'm going to work in a factory." It didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I thought how strange it was, but I expected to see George around, and I didn't. I would call his house but never get a call back. One day, several weeks later, I was at the intersection of Ovilla Road and 342. Most of you know where it is, there by the Exxon station. I saw George sitting in his truck on the other side of the intersection, so I started, as he was waiting for the light, honking and waving and acting a fool, trying to get his attention. He looked towards me, and I saw him look straight at me. Then he drove off. I was confused and really upset, and I thought, man, I've just lost a great friend, and I really didn't understand why. It wouldn't be for a few months later that I learned why George would not talk to me. I moved the story along to October 23rd, 1987. A day that would later teach me a lesson that I could never forget. That drugs can really hurt people even if they never use them. On October 23rd, 1987, it was a cool, damp evening, and I was working a football game at the high school. Red Oak was taking on Midlothian, and after the game, which we won, by the way, I went home to catch a few hours of sleep before I had to be back the next morning at 7 a.m. to start my shift. It was a nice morning. I remember I got into my squad car and I drove around town like I always did. I enjoyed waving at everyone and talking to everyone, and then take a call or two here or there. But again, it was a much slower time in Red Oak. I was driving around that morning, and my dispatcher, whose name was Amy at the time, came onto the radio, and she gave me an APB, an all-points bulletin from the Midlothian Police Department. She said, Midlothian police want you to be on the lookout for a white male with dark hair driving a red truck. This was nothing unusual. We got those kind of calls a lot. Maybe it would be a kid that didn't show up at home on time or people breaking down on the roadway somewhere. So I drove around town and I looked, but I didn't see anything. A couple of hours later, Amy came back on the radio. And this time she had a strange sound in her voice. She said, Midlothian Police Department have called back and they want us to be on the lookout for a white male, dark hair, red truck, and to check around the high school and the field areas. That was a little strange. Have you ever had a gut feeling? Something that just doesn't feel right? Most of you probably have. I felt that. I drove straight to the police department at that time, and it was so weird that Amy and I, at the same time, were walking towards each other. Oh, man. I said to her, man, they're looking for George, while she was saying the same thing back to me. Shortly thereafter, I would find out we were right. Midlothian Police Department called and said, okay, we have to tell you the truth. George Raffield is who we're looking for, and he's been working as an undercover police officer for us, trying to find out what kids were selling drugs and using drugs in our school. And we believe that something's happened to him. My heart sank, and I sat in the police department and listened to the police officers, from the Dallas police helicopter pilot and all the others, as they were starting to spread out and search areas around Midlothian. I kept thinking, as soon as my shift is over, I'm going to find my friend. And as I got ready to go, my chief called, and he ordered me to stay there. I was mad. You would be too. We want to find our friends, someone that we love. But I was told no. He knew what he was doing. A little later on, I heard these words that to this day, over 20 years later, I can't get out of my head. It was the Dallas police helicopter pilot on the radio. He told everyone to stop talking. And then he said this: Air 1, victim and vehicle found. Discontinue search. Notify family. With that, I knew that my friend was dead. What I would later find out is that George's mom and dad, who lived on the street behind the old high school, were sitting there at their kitchen table, listening to their police scanner. And they heard exactly what I did about their son. I got a call shortly thereafter. It was from George's mom. And she said, Tiger, which is what they called George, is dead. They killed him. I don't know what to do, she said. I cried on the phone with her. And she said, I have to plan my baby's funeral. And I need you to be a pallbearer and carry his casket. In the next few days, we would find out exactly what happened. George, after being hired by the Midlothian Police Department because he wanted to help kids get away from drugs, and because he looked young, was hired to be trained as an undercover police officer. He went into Midlothian High School pretending to be a student to find out who was bringing drugs and what kind of drugs were being brought. He met a kid shortly thereafter named Greg Knighton. His friends called him Sparky. Sparky was 16 and known by the other kids at Midlothian as a doper. Greg was friends with another kid named Richard Gigline, who was also a doper and said to be a devil worshiper. George was totally blown away by how much Greg wanted to do drugs and how he would even go into Dallas, into very bad areas, to buy drugs from street dealers. George got to know Greg's family, and he told his chief, when this is over, I know we have to arrest Greg, but I sure would like to help him. I think he could be a pretty good kid. A good kid. That good kid started to get scared, and after talking to a 30-year-old drug addict named Cynthia, who allowed kids to hang out at her apartment and do drugs, Cynthia told Greg that she thought George was a narc and that he had to be gotten rid of. On October the 23rd, as I was working that football game, George got a call from Greg who said, man, we're going to meet a big drug dealer from Dallas tonight here. We're going to score a lot of drugs. George reported he was pretty excited about that to his lieutenant. And he told him, he said, you know, we're finally going to get to help the people who need help. and we're going to catch the people who are ruining so many lives. George got pretty excited thinking he was going to finally help get the person who was ruining so many lives. George drove to pick up Greg and then get Richard. They drove outside of town to a field, a place that the kids call Devil's Hill. What he didn't know was that Greg had stolen a gun from his dad and had it with him. They sat in George's truck for a while, and as it started to get dark, they were talking about drugs and music and girls, and Greg said, "Let's get out and sit on the tailgate." As George got out of his side of the truck, Greg pointed towards a field as if to say someone was coming. And then he pulled the gun, and he fired 3 times, hitting my friend George twice in the back of the head. George fell on his face in a cold, wet field and died. You're going to be told many things by friends or those who pretend to be your friends, and some will tell you that drugs don't mess with you, that they're fun, and that the cops and other adults are just stupid. But I can tell you this. I'm a grown man. As I film this today, I'm 45 years old, and I've never taken an illegal drug in my life. But on October 23rd, 1987, I learned that drugs can hurt all of us if we allow anyone around us to do it. I believe that while some will tell you that drugs don't mess you up, I'll tell you this. If you're watching, you couldn't, I couldn't, in a normal day, in a normal way, with a normal head, take a gun, point it at me or anyone else, pull the trigger and take our lives for no reason. These drug addicts did. And then they walked away from George's body. They took his wallet from his pocket as he laid there, bled and died. They met up with another of their friends named Jonathan, who they had told they were going to kill George. And he did nothing to stop it. He even picked him up and he said, "Man," later to the police, "I didn't even believe they were really going to kill him." And I ask you this, what kind of idiot picks up people who said they were going to kill someone and then says, "I didn't believe them"? To prove how he didn't care, Greg went to his girlfriend's house that night and watched television. The rest of the evening, like nothing ever happened. We all have consciences. We all know right and wrong. We as normal people would have suffered so much, cared so much about even hurting somebody, much less killing someone, but Greg never did. He was arrested a few days later, not hiding out, being scared, but on the back of a hayride outside of Ovilla with his girlfriend. You're probably thinking, man, what kind of parents did this Greg have? They must have been really bad people. No, that's not true. Greg's dad was a Dallas police officer, a sergeant. Yeah, and his mom was a secretary at the local church. They were good people. People who gave their son all he needed, but he chose drugs over it all and allowed drugs to destroy so many lives. I carried George's casket through the church and into the hearse, and I listened as kids from Midlothian High School who were standing on both sides of the aisle said, "Man, we knew Greg. We knew Sparky was strange and a drug head, but we didn't think this would happen. Wake up and learn. Learn something that if you allow anyone to use drugs in your school, you too are being just like these kids. Any of them who could have went to a teacher, a principal, a parent, a police officer and said something, but they didn't." After the funeral, when everybody left, I as a pallbearer stood there and watched him drop his casket into the ground in the cemetery there in Waxahachie. I cried and then I drove back to Red Oak. I walked into my chief's office and I took my badge off and I laid it on his desk. And I told him I quit. This is a stupid job. You care about people. You do the right thing. And this is what happens. And I walked out of the police department and I drove to the First Baptist Church parking lot across from the old Red Oak Elementary School there on Red Oak Road. And I cried. And I cried. And I banged on my steering wheel and I cried. And then I looked up for a moment. Across the street, I saw a little blonde-haired girl. She's probably about 6 or 7 years old. And she was standing at that fence, away from all of her friends, standing at the fence looking across at me, waving and waving, trying to get my attention. And I stopped and I thought, oh man, my friend George gave his life, gave it up so that people like this little girl could live in a world free from drugs. And now I'm walking away. I don't know who she was, but I know this. She changed my mind, changed my life. And I decided at that point to fight back. And I asked for my badge back. And I promised I would do everything I could to make sure that this never happened to anyone again. At the trial, both Greg Knighton and Richard Gieglein were sentenced to 45 years in prison. Cynthia and Jonathan, who helped out, were given jail time, but each were released in just over a year. Both Greg and Richard have both been up for parole a few times, but each time they were denied. And they're still spending their lives in prison, where I hope they stay forever. Sometimes they may get out. And people will say, you know, that's not fair. George didn't ever get out. And I agree with that, but I'll say this. They have no life and no future. They have no kids, no family. Probably never will. They'll never have the joys that you have today as a drug-free person. I don't believe people who choose to do drugs and choose to take a person's life deserve to live next to you, work near you, or even drive in the same places we live. Again, I don't know if they'll ever get out, but they probably will. George will never have those kids he wanted, who could have been some of your best friends. What George can know is this: his life was not given up in vain, but it made your life better. It made your life better because you're hearing this story today, and if you choose and make the decision, no matter if you're 5 or 55, and you promise now the rest of your life to live a drug-free lifestyle, it will honor Him. I was lucky to get to start Project Success classes a long time ago. And now many of my first students are teachers, police officers, lawyers, and other successful people. And many of them will still tell you that George Raffield is part of the reason why they had this success. I hope you enjoy Project Success this year. And I hope when you're asked to sign a drug-free contract or make that commitment, that you're going to think of this, that you're going to think of George Raffield, my friend and my hero. There's a 5th grade level book in your library called A Hero Named George, if you're a student. There's an adult book called Innocence Lost about George Raffield. I love George Raffield and always will. He's a hero. And you can honor him by living a drug-free lifestyle, a lifestyle free of illegal drugs. Our officers and I may not ever know all of your names. We want to, but there are now over 5,000 students in Red Oak ISD. But while we will never know your name, we will know your face. And we'll let you know this. I've said this many times, and people kind of laugh. But I mean this. I'm going to love you, all of you, whether you like it or not. So get used to it. I thank you for listening today. I suffered a great deal. His family suffered a great deal. George's mother and father have now passed away. And I believe that they're with George again. But I know that for many, many years, they had Christmases without him. They had birthdays without him. And it was because of drugs. Again, you're going to hear a lot of things about illegal drugs in your lifetime. This one's the truth. If I were in your classroom, I could tell you about other students from Red Oak who are in cemeteries nearby. I could tell you about so many lives destroyed. But it's your choice. You make the decision. You make the difference. Project Success Drug Education thanks you. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being drug-free and proud.